I'm particularly pleased to have Wallis here. I met Wallis at the Geneva Writers Group quite a few years ago, and we've been attending their workshops, and we've been teaching. Wallis and I developed a friendship over the years, so I get to see her every time, almost every time she comes to New York to visit her family. She writes memoir, poetry, novels. She writes beautiful critical pieces as well. She has lived in Italy for more than 40 years, and thus outside her native language, English. So this makes language and its relationship to identity and difference and otherness, I would say, a central subject of her writing. Wallis's poetry travels along the lines of inner to outer. It is a voice that is speaking to a reader, not to a crowd. As a cross-cultural writer, her work has a rhythm of back and forth, and like language itself, the conjugations of reality change between past and present, future and hypothetical, always with the idea of opening doors and possibilities. James Gill, a Swiss publisher, said that he had discovered only 2 poets in his time as a publisher. And he wrote, someday, Wallis Wilde-Menozzi's work will be sought after and recognized for what it is, a poetic speech that rises like a tide out of language, engulfing us. Wallis published more than 100 poems in Agni, Kenyan Review, the London Review, Notre Dame Review, Malahat Review. Her poetic speech drives all 4 of her books of prose, especially the one that will be published in the fall of this year by Farrar, Straus and Giraud, Silence and Silences. I have an interview with her, which I sent around to people before, and I could send it again to people who would like, in Michigan Quarterly Review. It's an interview, a dialogue about silence and silences. And I have a review of her novel Toscanelli's Ray, which it's a tremendous novel in my opinion, and I think it really deserves to be read more widely. But tonight, I must say, Wallis, I very much look forward to a collection of poems by you, and I hope FSG comes through with an offer for you to do this. And I know that tonight will be a very special reading. So welcome everyone to the Literary Excursions. We all look forward to hearing you, Wallis.
Good. Isn't it great that we're all connected in so many places? It's 10 o'clock here in Italy, and then in Europe it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In New York, people who are out on the West Coast, it's earlier in the day, and yet somehow in this new reality we're in, we can all collect ourselves together on a screen. And it seemed, while I was preparing for this, I felt pretty nervous because everything seemed far away and I didn't know who I was talking to. But now I see basically through the screen that I really am among a lot of friends. On the whole, I think I really know almost everyone here. So I hope I hope we can find the right level of intimacy in a way for this conversation. It is Women's Day today, and at the end of I was told, I'll read one poem at the end. And so I'll read a very specifically women's poem at the end of our conversation tonight. But it's amazing when we think about women's poetry. I think we have to say that in this time, there are new voices that are growing exponentially, day to day, week to week, month to month, all over the world. Women are feeling empowered and finding ways to write about the way they see reality and how they interpret reality in this time. But really, we have to say, who do we thank? Who do we thank for the fact that we're all now writing? And so many, many, many more of us are writing. And we look backwards, you know, and we look at the Anna Akhmatova, who's standing outside a prison and waiting for her news of her son, who's probably going to be killed. And she's standing there and someone asks her, could she write about this story? And she's a witness. And we look back and we see Emily Dickinson, who was writing in an earlier time all by herself and really writing to a world that didn't recognize her at all, didn't recognize the intensity and brilliance of her mind and her search. And she could write, I am nobody, who are you? With that feeling that it was a line, of course, that Ulysses used. So it had come from somewhere else, but we can understand the pain of the question as she asked it. We can look back to Sappho. In that time she was writing, it wasn't as difficult or unusual in some ways as it became in centuries that followed. We look at Anne Carson, who translated her and who writes a kind of poetry which is very radical and quickly turns into fiction. We look at Nobel Prize winners. Wisława Szymborska was given the Nobel Prize in 1996, and Louise Gluck was given it this year. And we hear voices that are very different indeed, one from another. I think today, particularly since it's Women's Day, I would very much like to remember a very amazing and powerful poet and woman, Mina Alexander, who we lost about a year and a half ago. And in some ways, we'll never lose Mina because she wrote and produced a body of work and gave to the world a voice which will not be extinguished. It was a kind of light that opened up so many paths for others. And we're left with her courage, and we're left with work of incredible beauty. And we can take the words she gave to one of her memoirs, which was called Fault Lines. And she defined these fault lines as, of course, fractions, earthquakes, a kind of physical meaning to the word fault line. Fault also means guilty, or someone who was at fault. She drives us into new lands, opening up different meanings to words. And as I said, particularly on Women's Day, Mina gave a voice that was particularly attentive to women's themes and points of view. And she added a sensuous kind of use to language that I think enriches us all. And we miss her. I miss her a lot, and I know many of you who are listening do. She also carried us into cross cultures and explained the fact that much literature that was going to be written in the future was going to be written by people who started in one country and ended up somewhere else. And they would have to form language from the joins or from the fault lines. In poetry and in women's poetry, each voice is different, and each voice has a focus on reality. And there's much in poetry that speaks to the public it's a public voice, and there is developing such a thing as a woman's public voice, a woman speaking in some ways to a large audience. As I had written to Carmen, I really have always been interested in a voice that is basically a conversation perhaps even with myself, but if not, a conversation to someone else, but not to a large audience, not to a crowd, a kind of use of language that is intimate in some way without being confessional. I think as I came to live outside my language, living in Parma, my poems became longer and longer and longer and longer. And so did my lines, so did my use of language. And so eventually I sort of flowed into prose. This isn't a unique thing. And I think most women writers sort of cross borders, and writers who were even living in one land, but feeling differences, felt this question of crossing borders. Virginia Woolf, more than 100 years ago, certainly felt it. And she felt the conflicts and the contrast between poetry, prose, between reality and hallucination. She went back and forth, and she pushed across borders. And I think women, as they start writing, since they have not been writing for a long, long, long time, they have so many ways. They can start in one place and end up in another. They are explorers, they are discoverers, and they are each speaking from a reality that in part has not been spoken of before. They're adding to an ever-growing body of work. So I realized that most of my poetry is really quite long. It is probably, if you knew it, if you had seen it, if you could read it, it might be easy, but I don't want to leave you in the cold in terms of the poems I'm going to read. So I'll try to give a little frame to the work, but it won't be specifically speaking to any theme. I hope I can hold you together, and personally, I think you could interrupt me even between poems if I could help you out in any way. I think my theme is really the present. How do you write about the present? Because the present doesn't exist. And the present is always the past. And the present also contains the future. And the present is always known and unknown. And it's confined by language, and it's freed by language. So I'd like to work on that particular focus and theme as we read, as I read, and we'll see what we can do with it. The first poem that I'm going to read is a little bit challenging because it really is called It's Now. So it's trying in a way to take on the fact of how do you write about now. It's now. It's night. That grainy videotape night, and no moon. There's a train leaving, and all the vague uncertainty of leaving without knowing. And it's now. Not books or stories about cattle cars loaded with innocence. There are no real people clustering there, entering the second carriage on an oblique angle. Not this time. These are shades, maybe your own doubts, dressed in rough winter coats? Or are they neighbors or your own brothers? How can a voice talking to you in sleep tell you what you know with your eyes wide open? Did you ever dream it would be so hard? That raucous bum trailing you. And when you face him abruptly, he cries. Put your arm around him, and he's luminous. And the stalled train there in the yard, shovelers with bowed heads, clearing the tracks, lifting in slow motion, snow, snow. It's so quiet. Put a foot down and another. It feels like digging. Listen. This morning, wasn't it the garden? Geraniums, silly tasseled clowns in the windows, wide open, and the house frescoed with bright laughter? Or was it there? This inwardness, this unforgiving story of little crimes. Against what? The present opening. Call it ocean, this beautiful moment, this minute. So that was a little, I don't know if it was too heavy a way to get in, but now we're in. I think the next poem I would like to read is one about poetry itself, why we write poetry. It's a privilege to write poetry. It's a need. It's a drive to uncover what is not known and to try to discover how to give it a shape and how to give it a shape that's authentic. This poem is called Once I Never Thought of Knowing. Once I never thought of knowing writers, people who filled pages with adventures, but more interesting inner life, hearing songs inside the lilacs, penning phrases like, "You must change your life." Now, in most astounding freedom, I have shelves of books signed, not in shopping center malls, but by people whose ways I follow. Yet it was not knowing writers that changed me, nor knowing even that I could write, but knowing there were eternal ways. Words bring water to a desert. The next poem is an image, the way some poems come to all of us when we see something and suddenly we realize it has a slightly larger reverberation, and the circle enlarges from a literal event into taking us somewhere else. This is called Red Foxes in the Apennines. It was the fall, we were taking a walk, and these little foxes began to travel behind us. Red foxes in the Apennines, more sinuous than icy water foaming below. The holly-pawed fox gazed at us like a planet with hungry eyes. Snow danced in its tail. Its red mate appeared. Bare oaks whispered. Both heads lifted in the wind. To their left and right, coming. Winter, like a Bible. We all have been shut in, and we're all kind of waiting for spring wherever we are located tonight. I think spring in various forms is coming. And it was very much, the seasons and nature are very much a part of my work. And of course, being in one place, spring arrives, it arrives, and it arrives. But of course, every year, life has turned, life has changed. And so a topic like spring changes immensely from year to year when I'm inspired by it. We're in the seasons, and I was saying the seasons have showed up in my poetry. Nature has showed up, but of course the season and the meaning of the season changes because the world changes and time changes. And so a topic like a word spring changes depending on the angle you take on it. And this is a poem, a spring poem written in a way to the kind of period we're just coming out of. It's when the blooms begin to appear. And it's called Rock to Sleep in Day. Petals from the cherry tree, a friendly snow, white rounded brushings, transparent, one sticks to my cheek. Lilacs open up, deep in a cluster, the metronome escaping scent, where nothing was in winter. The fern, hidden and now curled, uncurls its underground eluding spores. Vagabond dream storm of unloosening snow seed, poplars. Rock to sleep in day, we draw close to this thickening edge. We live from the inside, from the waiting, the worm-ridden, dark emptiness, now opening these appearances. This is another angle on spring. It's a little heavy too, but spring, as many poets have told us, is the most difficult time of year. This is a poem, though, basically about the unknown again in time, the unknown in the minute, the unknown in events, in things that seem normal and suddenly they're not. And this was a poem written in Parma. It's rather self-evident, but it was also true, the event in this poem where there was also poisoning that went on in the hospital. Things were happening very fast, and they were all unknown the minute before. The poem is called Pages. It was a week for friends when sky moved off its assiduous hub. One looked at an image and a shadow had cornered his eye, and they said, out, and left him eyeless. Another, a doctor who works at healing, watched two men in her ward clutch at their hearts and fall, with minutes left to roll in agony before death came. Poisoned somehow, hauled out on stretchers, dead to the stars. And at dinner 2 nights ago, another so timid she can't leave home, talked about the charred smell of her school, where fire broke out, lit by someone. Rumor turns vague, but the whisper is terrorists. Talk is one thing, spring too, with its leaves remain rumor up to a point. Then it overwhelms the mud and takes over the bridges, leading us to the inescapable as the sun strikes out over the lifting sky, and we are left with it, our hands trembling. The river moving downstream is our only book. Its pouring pages write us and all our possessions, especially our bodies, into its slipping flow. And they will all float by us, and we will reach. Terrorists are certainly a topic that's been very alive in Italy for decades. It's a topic, though, that of course exists in other places. And again, voices then take it up from different angles, depending on the experience they had and how they were living it. I think that's what when we're teaching writing, that's what we're always trying to encourage, and what we hope we'll see is people will tell their own stories. They will take their own angles. They will understand language and deepen it and give it back new to us. This is a poem on immigration, again, a topic that's very real. It's been very real in Italy for a long time. It's certainly been an issue in the United States. It's been an issue in Europe. It's been an issue for the people who have had to immigrate, who've been homeless, who've been living in countries where they've had to hide, countries where they're not welcome, countries which have had the power really to play with their lives. It's not a new theme, it's an old theme. It's an important reality. This is a poem that came out of the immigration office that is in Parma. It used to have lines that went on for blocks and blocks and blocks every morning. That was when people were rushing into Italy illegally, landing in Sicily, and then finding their way. This is, I've been working with Nigerian women in Parma who all are immigrants who came in illegally, crossing the sea, risking their lives. Each of these stories is moving in a different way. And any rate, this is the poem on the immigration office. It's called Borgo Riccio, which is the street. Borgo Riccio, the immigration office. The short street filled by asking sometimes reaches a roar of wanting sounds. Desperation moves longer lines. Each day, more bodies. This street filled by asking jabbers as if monkeys, tapirs, Siberian bears pace strange and out of place, because only cows and pigs live in the fertile hills here. Leopard spots are unwelcome, but so are dirty kids. I feel a late sense of belonging to the clamor and need, no longer surprised if my wants match those of lives that fled from wars. Tell it, I say to a man, shaking 2 coins in an empty hat. Don't turn away in humble anger. Sing cart-rutted streets, your language, its honeycombs and scars, birded sunrises, graves with names, and parched mounds without them. Show me where you live. As I said, there's always a surprise in almost anything, any day, any way we live. There are always other people to discover, other suffering to discover, other pleasures that people have seen, other ways of imagining things. This was a poetry festival in Verona. I had been invited, it was International Poetry Day. The year was March 20th, 2003, and the Iraq War began on that day. And it began almost like a reality show. It was announced the war would begin at 9 o'clock, and you could turn on your television and see the bombs starting to fall. It was a very tense and difficult moment. I was there with people who were presenting a petition which had been signed by thousands of poets. It was called Poets Against the War. And people who had been working very hard to see if we couldn't intervene, we found ourselves completely helpless in the end as the war started. But what was surprising about that evening to me was really, as I said, it was a story. Even now, I could tell it from the standpoint of women. There were probably only 2 or 3 women poets there. But that wasn't the story I had to tell when I started that poem. It was really about the fact of how many people in how many places write about injustice and write about torture and write about war. And that was what really came out that night. It's called the Poetry Festival in Verona. As poets, we gathered. The night bombs started their incineration. The ceremony stopped, and a small TV produced the unreal hours blacking out before. Months of shifting incandescent reasons, petitions and pens, hope-lifting doubt, torched when fires switched on houses and roads, people condemned by place. We watched flames while our poems remained white in our hands. Suddenly, the need to voice turned. A few poets began to speak. The Cambodian held family as a handful of bones. The Chilean's brother never walked home from the Moneda. The Bolivian, an ambassador, paid 7 years in solitary confinement. The Bolivian left through the revolving door. Snowy night winds made him shiver more. At the iced-over river, he waved off our offer of a needed coat. Amigos, this is only night 1. He was really telling us we had a lot of work to do. It was just beginning with the war beginning. Our petition didn't work, but we had a lot of other ways we could still get involved. This is one more of those poems about involvement, I think, in dreams, images that take us from one place to another in a journey. It's called Inside Those Rocking Walls. If dreams are our own minds, inside those rocking walls, ghosts, ancestors in the ethers, the way our cells wind and wire, slip from their night world. I did not know how to work with them, but now I look up as if for startling sounds. Putting on lipstick in front of my mirror, the gaudy lady whispered, "Fog wraps your graying head, curved shoulders. Venice sinks, streets throng, pain cries. Don't evade the deep end. Have you ever tried to wade into the freighted sea, lapping your front steps?" I'll give you a little woman's poem that's maybe a little break, at least from some of these poems. This was a poem that came out very fast. It came out at the Geneva Writers' Workshop. It was an answer to a prompt by another poet who asked us to write about our senses. I had no idea that this poem was going to come out. And now in the Skype, since I see that my older brother is listening, it actually has him in the poem. It's about I think being raised in a place where there was an extreme lack of attention to the senses, and there was an extreme lack of sort of believing in sensuality, and there were very strict rules about what girls could do, and what boys could do. And I could say one more thing in this poem. There's this reference to pipe for fuel. We had a tank that was filled every fall for the winter fuel that heated our house at a very high temperature. And we didn't know it, but we could unscrew the lid, and the fumes from the gasoline was just delightful. And although it may have, so we'd lie out there for hours just breathing the fumes in, because we really had, we were not supervised, nor were we very busy. It's called The Busts. My parents said apartheid things, girls can't and won't, and tied my arms and legs between two brothers. Girls were to be like the house, bearing no smell, but of the house, erased in poofy spray. Looking for taste led me outside to the pipe for fuel. I turned feral, birthing myself. All summer, lying on my stomach, I grew high on fumes. Breathing pleasure in, my head unwound in petrol scents from the underground. The cedar chest was another lid, lifted for pure swoons. All of winter was inside that box, and I'd spin in the rush of it. But salt, life's flavor, appeared most lacking. Its white crystals twinkled from an imposing line of rock salt busts on my older brother's windowsill. Mozart, Schubert, Bach, Liszt, all men in wigs. The way his prizes gleamed across the world they lived in was salt denied to me. One night I held Beethoven in my hand, loved his cool weight and the sonata that my brother played to much applause. Suddenly my tongue briefly touched a nose. In other moonlight, I returned and licked his broad face, his wig, his neck, his ruffled shirt. Several stolen visits passed before his face was smooth. More moonlight, and I licked poor Schubert, young and dying young. I used my tongue, told not to speak, curious, told not to seek. And only now, in an exercise on senses, do the clumsy, hopeless raids uncover laughter, and unexpectedly, a taste of salt, of tears. This is a poem called Watermarks, and I realize while I'm reading it too, I have a nephew who's an artist who makes money using currency, and this is a poem about currency. Italian money used to be very large and very beautiful. Lira were numbers that were so astounding. You could have a 10,000 lira bill, you could have a 50,000 lira bill, you could have a 100,000 lira bill. So of course, they all seemed very important, and you felt very rich. And also the bills, there was, as Italy does about so many things, that the money was beautiful, and it was, and usually it celebrated artists on the bill itself. And then it had a watermark to test whether the bill was counterfeit or not. And often in the watermark, you'd see a work done by the artist. The poem is called Watermarks, and I think it's, again, a little journey from one place to another. The old Italian bills made you feel rich. Large as miniatures, muted colors, scenes with intricate watermarks, held up to the light in the days when show was not for everyone's eyes. Like love, there the real face appeared. On the money, Buonarroti with his boxer nose underneath or inside or between David's head, a mirror against counterfeiting. False, a serious word. All the zeros on the bills made money seem ridiculous. But like love, when illuminated, it went a long way. There was not so much of it flowing, work modestly paid, but like love, consequent, the attraction to have and to keep. Beautiful, kisses, avid for the real face. Money, imagine checking it by light.
First of all, I just wanted to say quickly to thank you. Listening to your beautiful poems, and there's such a wide range of things that you're talking about. I am reminded actually of Mina's line. Now that you mentioned Mina Alexander at the beginning of the reading, an invisible grammar holds us in place. How true, what a wonderful way, I think, that line that describes your reading today. This, everything that is said and that is not said, that is asked and that is not asked, coming together to hold us in place, to give us a sense of existence and solidity. So here we are celebrating you and Mina, and hopefully all the other wonderful women poets you mentioned at the beginning of this reading. Now, Pramila is going to lead us through the open mic session here. She is going to chair this, and then she'll bring you back around for that one last poem.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pramila Venkateshwaran. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you, and it's really lovely to host this reading along with Carmen Bugan. First of all, I want to thank you, Wallis. That was such a beautiful reading. In fact, as you were reading, I was writing down like some of the lovely images that you came up with in many of your poems. Like it was so interesting to look at the image of the little girl being tied arms and legs between two brothers. I mean, it was funny at the same time. It is true. What a powerful image. And I loved all the different themes. Especially, it was very powerful when you talked about war and migration. You brought out the emotion in many of those poems, and you were talking about also things that we do not know, the unreal hours. What does it feel like to be in a dream or between dream and reality? So very much appreciated all what you read. So we're moving on to the open mic. If there are a couple of people who would like to read a poem, please select a poem. And you can even put down your name in chat if you'd like to read. Okay, it looks like we don't have anybody who wants to read.
Okay, then we can have Wallis read 2 more poems then. We can have her, unless people have
do you have any questions? We can move on to, if you have a question for Wallis, you can ask her. I think Alex would like to ask something. Oh, I thought you raised your hand. If you have a question for Wallis.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So Wallis, absolutely wonderful. And I'm so struck. I mean, there's so many things to say about these poems. One of the things that I love the way you began this, you framed this, and that Akhmatova, where she's standing outside the Lubyanka, and this woman is asking, can you describe this? And that Akhmatova says, yes, I can describe this. And I'm thinking about you in the solitude writing poems, but also like Akhmatova, being a witness, But what is so powerful in like the poem Pages about the hospital, and also then the immigration, where you are getting others to use their voice. So, I mean, it's a real leap. Akhmatova is not asking the woman to write this. She's not, but you are. You are asking someone to bring their own experience into and their world into ours. But I love the range of the poems, and I think that poem about that you read at the end about childhood is just magnificent. So I just want to say that. But I love this tension in your work between the solitude that it takes to write the poems and to be the poet, and to also be the person who's the witness who comes back to give voice to herself and others. So that's it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ali.
Nice to see you, Ally.
This is very fascinating, the relationship, well, there are different kinds of relationships writers have with language, and some of them are intellectual, some of them are emotional, some of them bring all of them together is also obviously the knowledge and the depth one has in language. It's fascinating with translation, self-translation, writing in a non-native language is a wonderful conversation. You know, we should have once, I think we should have a seminar on this, where a talk where people come and talk about their experiences with different languages. That would be great fun to do in this series, to dedicate a session just to this conversation, because I find it very important. It certainly is very important to my life. And Pramila, you know, with your languages, you know, all of the people who are multilingual would appreciate that. Relationship with the language is what it is at the base of it. That allows us to have that gratitude towards the language and the confidence to express ourselves and to write ourselves, our deep self in another language, isn't it?
That's right.
Brilliant. Would you like to give us one last poem, and then we conclude the event for today?
Sure. Oh, I'm trying to think if I should. I think I'll read a woman's poem because it's Women's Day, and this poem is too long, like many of the poems, so I'll just read parts of it. But it does speak to silence, and it speaks to the millions and millions and millions of people who've never written their stories, but perhaps they don't need to all write them. They can share them, they can tell them, and then some people can take those stories up and move them further along. But this is a poem about silence in some ways. It's called Sewing, a 19th century sampler. And a sampler, for those of you who don't know it, it's a kind of needlework that women did. You know, they made flowers and designs, they cross-stitched and so on. There were also things like quilting and quilts. So this is a poem called Sewing, a 19th century sampler. A needle is small enough, a tool to pierce the void safely, move across an empty space, meticulously not forgetting there are limits. There is balance to threading an eye, to see the world opening up, to pass through it, to be tied, a moment flaring like dawn before she knows where she is. How many stitches made quantifies by far the vaster portion of the world. Think of how little we remember even of yesterday. How many birds soared from the pines. How many queues we stood in might have been moving towards executions. How many times you thought blue was your color. What twists in diurnal stitches is no longer remembered. They marched in silence like nameless soldiers in others' atrocious wars, motions arranging in different garments from necessity, while underneath the heart was subverted from obliquity by pulsations that still revive. Wordless sorrow endured for a child, doubt springing from wringing a chicken's neck, dry mirth erupting into a kiss. How little we know about women's journeys, even taken across a piece of cloth, deep in a Wisconsin winter, in a cabin besieged by frost. We imagine it a running stitch made by a loneliness, pricking an unmoving homespun sea, with lumps of infant graves scattered through a frozen churchyard and limp grain sacks measuring a conundrum of uncertainty. But couldn't these determined trips have been a means of convalescing from the terror we cover up with speed, of proceeding through silence, pinning it down, and in those spaces tugging an unadorned definition of living from a pre-adorned space, of occasionally marking what is infinite with cotton stars and daisies she knows are not the real thing, but the insistent stirring around her. There is prodigious silence in thread. It is a migrant walk through life, seen as such, the nameless resolution to put something together. What was it? The spool unwound, dropped from her lap, rolled across the floor, and then rolled back. Now we'll skip ahead. If we are careful, we can almost hear messages and the impassive marks she made in conversations with herself, passing from the wrong to the right side of the cloth. The million crossings unnoticed by those nearby, blood spurting as she jams the needle through her thumb. Now we skip ahead. Her use of thread opposed. Words, it seems, were the bell jars, traps. Unlike them, thread does not hide itself nor scar by making one thing stand for another. Inside words, she heard a violated universe, souls without tongues, stars reversed at the edge of night. Alone, lying awake, moonlight gripping her wrist, she knew the bodiless voices said, "We are here with you." Understand the word rib, and we come to a terrifying chink of the inhuman wall she lived behind. Thread was a way to unblindfold, stab, chant against her own disappearance. On sheets, blankets, little coats, she wrote and wrote. With her needle, she described an unrecoverable resistance to a world dumb and deaf to her. Bent over cloth with painstaking insistence, she struggled with her startling spelling of existence. So.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Wallis.
Sure.
Thank you very much. It was a fantastic reading, and we're all very grateful that you were here. And I am very grateful to have such a wonderful audience. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you next month